Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
We have some fun stuff to talk about today. Let's start with T-Mobile. So just recently, a few days ago, there was a joint statement put out by the FBI and CISA that the People's Republic of China has been targeting commercial telecommunications infrastructure. This was also reported back a couple weeks ago, and we already know that AT&T, Verizon, and Lumen have reported that they were breached, but T-Mobile also confirmed this week that they were hacked in a wave of attacks that were conducted by these Chinese threat actors. In their statement, T-Mobile says that their systems and data have not been impacted in any significant way, and we have no evidence of impacts to customer information, which is a little bit different because AT&T and Verizon and Lumen did report that there were evidence that data was exfiltrated.
Yeah, and one thing about corporate statements like this, I know people have a healthy dose of cynicism with the way corporations make public statements. And one of the things you can do is put on your almost attorney's hat and parse the language very carefully to see what it does and doesn't say. This is a very plain language statement, and it makes pretty unequivocal statements in that there's no like wiggle room here, or like I call it corporate weasel language, where they say things like may not have or no indication of. They said it like a matter of fact, have not been impacted, then not we haven't determined yet, but we haven't seen or anything like that. And we have no evidence. Now, there is a little more wiggle room there of impacts to customer information. But again, a pretty definitive statement. So I know as information security professionals, we always approach things with cynicism. It's what makes us good at our jobs. But the one thing is corporations do not lie. People have this false perception that corporations will outright lie to you. They won't do that. They will use, again, corporate weasel language to obfuscate facts or to hide behind statements that don't really mean below the surface what they seem to say on the surface. But again, I think this is a good, clear, single sentence statement that that's pretty tight. So I think we can take this at face value. But that's something we should always do whenever we evaluate statements like this, is put on almost our attorney hat and parse the language word by word. What are they really saying and what are they not saying? So good statement out of T-Mobile here.
And the Wall Street Journal did report last month about these state-sponsored actors that are also known as Salt Typhoon. And they reported that the purpose of the attacks was to gather intelligence that was used by the federal government for court-authorized network wiretapping requests. It was pretty targeted and specific on what they were looking for. And so it's really interesting just to see what these attackers are up to. Salt Typhoon, that name, is the one that Microsoft gave to this China-based threat actor, which coincidentally, if you didn't know, anything that's named Typhoon is a attacker from China when Microsoft refers to it. And other organizations, other cybersecurity companies that are tracking this, they name them differently. Like, for example, Earth Estries is Trend Micro's name. ESET names them Famous Sparrow. Kaspersky named them Ghost Emperor, and UNC 2286 is what Mandiant, also part of the Google Cloud now, is what they named them.
So this, before you go on, soapbox moment for Adam, and this is going to tie into multiple discussions we've had on this show, Andy, where we have talked about things like Apple's encryption with iPhones and how there's been this regular drumbeat from law enforcement that we should create a backdoor that just law enforcement can use, just the good guys can use to break into iPhones so they can get evidence for cases or any other law enforcement activities. And of course, they're going to protect it and only the good guys are going to use it, right? And There's been demands by governments that we should create encryption, just overall encryption that has backdoors that just the good guys can use. And then organizations love to set up SSL decryption on their network where they decrypt all SSL traffic and inspect it as it flows through their network. And I have often made the case on this show that's an incredibly attractive target to attackers, because if they could sit in memory and sniff everything flowing through it, they have unencrypted access to plain text secrets that are passing through that system. And of course, your intent is for you, the good guys, to use it. And you're not considering what happens if it falls into the bad guy's hands. Well, here is government mandated wiretapping equipment that sits inside the T-Mobile network that now the People's Republic of China has broken in and accessed. Again, intended just for the good guys' use, but now it has fallen into the wrong hands, and the bad guys were able to access it and attempt to use it for nefarious purposes. It goes to show there is no way to create a backdoor in any system or to break decryption in any way that does not become an incredibly attractive target to attackers. And this is why I have been consistent on this show, and Andy, I believe you have too, that although we understand law enforcement is a hard job, and we need to give them the tools they need to do their job to bring bad people to justice, weakening decryption for everyone and creating additional attack surface for these bad actors is not the solution. And here is a perfect real world example of the drum I've been beating for years on this show, why you shouldn't do SSL decryption in your network and why we shouldn't build these backdoors into decryption systems or iPhones or anything else, because the bad guys will attack them and use them. And so I'll get off my soapbox now, but I've been waiting to talk about this because it is such a perfect example of the risk we have always articulated that was out there.
The vector of attack that was reported supposedly was conducted through vulnerabilities in Cisco routers, but Cisco released a statement saying that they weren't aware of any vulnerabilities. But of course, like, there have been numerous vulnerabilities that have been patched, so maybe, there were a few that were unpatched. And so that really just goes to making sure that you are keeping up with those security patches and hot fixes. Coincidentally, this is the 9th breach that T-Mobile has suffered since 2019. The previous ones have been connected to customer data and other things. But in this one, they're saying that there wasn't any evidence of that, which I think goes to show that T-Mobile, being one of the more attacked targets throughout the last few years, has really stepped up their security game, because we all know that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and when you detect it and how much data is going to be exfiltrated and what is going to fall into the hands of the attackers. And so, it's their 9th breach, but in this case, nothing significant. And it also goes to show, we've talked about it on this show, how much consumers really pay attention to breaches, and does that impact their business, and does it impact the company's financial statements. And it's funny, we do this information security podcast, and they have been breached multiple times, including customer data. But I'm still a customer with T-Mobile, and Adam, you're still a customer with T-Mobile. I've been with them for years.
Yeah.
And this isn't going to change my business with them. I'm still going to be a customer. I've definitely thought about leaving them due to all this, but the alternatives, Verizon and AT&T, aren't much better. They were hacked in this attack as well, and they actually had stuff taken out. So, it's funny. I just think about, in the security business, we spend all this money on stuff. Maybe T-Mobile, in this case, it's paying out because they actually were able to detect it and not suffer anything great resulting from it. But it doesn't really move the needle too much when it comes to business.
Yeah, exactly right. And I've been warning about that risk on the show for years too, is as consumers become more numb to these events, and as Wall Street becomes more numb to these events, a lot of the justification of cybersecurity budget and investment has been the risk of a catastrophic loss of stock value. catastrophic loss of business. And to be clear, there are organizations that have still suffered catastrophic business operation impact where production lines have been down for days or weeks, or MGM resorts couldn't check people into rooms and had their casino floors shut down and cost them millions, hundreds of millions, multi-millions because of a cybersecurity incident. So it's not just reputational damage, and that's not what the sole reason to invest in cybersecurity, but that as a justification for investment, to be honest, is diminishing with time because there is less reputational damage from a customers choosing not to do business with you or from a Wall Street choosing not to invest in you kind of approach anymore. And so that's different. It's almost shifted where we're less concerned with the reputational damage and more concerned with business continuity and business operations and maintaining those moving forward, which could shift how we approach our jobs in the long run.
All right. So keeping in that theme with Chinese state-sponsored actors, this came across my feed and it's a fascinating read. Sophos published a report on their intelligence that they gathered from nearly a 5-year cat and mouse game with a bunch of state-sponsored Chinese attackers. The report details on how Sophos as a company went as far as discreetly installing their own implants on the Chinese hackers' Sophos devices to monitor and preempt their attempts at exploiting its firewalls. So they released hotfixes with additional code to monitor what these actors were doing. They were able to narrow it down to a region, to a specific company that was testing all of their exploits. And eventually they were even able to obtain some malware that the hackers were designing. It was a specimen of something called a bootkit, which was designed to hide undetectable within the firewall's low-level code used to boot up the devices. And that has never been seen in the wild before. So these attackers were testing this bootkit, and Sophos was able to find intelligence about it and was able to patch it. And in the process, Sophos analysts identified a series of hacking campaigns that were started with indiscriminate mass exploitation of its products, but eventually became more stealthy and targeted. And they were hitting nuclear energy suppliers, regulators, military targets, including a military hospital, telecoms, government, and intelligence agencies, and the airport of one national capital. The Sophos report ties those hacking campaigns with varying levels of confidence to specific Chinese state-sponsored hacking groups, including those known as APT-41, APT-31, and Volt Typhoon, the latter of which is a particularly aggressive team that has sought the ability to disrupt critical infrastructure in the U.S., including the power grids. But one of the more common themes throughout the efforts is not necessarily the previously identified hacker groups, but instead a broader network of researchers that have developed hacking techniques and supplied them to the Chinese government. There's an interesting correlation between the independence of these research facilities, these hackers that are testing these exploits, and then the Chinese government saying that if you do find exploits, you have to turn them over to the Chinese government, and then the Chinese government then redistributes it to their attackers to use against adversaries like the United States. But at the same time, it's loose because in one of the instances, the attackers actually submitted one of the original vulnerabilities that they were using for attacking to Sophos as part of their bug bounty. And Sophos actually paid the attackers $20,000 for that bounty, that bug bounty, which is interesting because it's like, well, the Chinese government requires them to turn it over, but then they're also trying to make some money on the side because they reported the original one and maybe they don't care if that one is being used, or they're depending on people not patching those devices. So really interesting stuff. It's a fascinating read. Kudos to Sophos in telling their story because they're basically trying to help us get a glimpse of this China pipeline of like hacking research and development, and then just breaking the industry's silence around larger vulnerability issues in security appliances that are serving as an entry point for hackers. For example, in the past year, there have been security flaws that have been found in Avante, Fortinet, Cisco, Palo Alto that have all been exploited in mass hacking or targeted intrusion campaigns. And Sophos Chief Information Security Officer, Ross McKercher, basically said, this is becoming an open secret and people are understanding that this is happening, but everyone is quiet about it. We're taking a different approach, trying to be transparent and to address this head on and meet our adversaries on the battlefield. I think this is great stuff. And it really gives me a lot of confidence in what the security researchers are doing. Kudos to Sophos in publishing this and giving more awareness and intelligence on how China is attacking us and developing. And of course, if you read the report, you'll see that the majority of the companies and government agencies that were attacked were actually part of Asia, but they have also attacked the Western countries as well. So it's not that we're exempt. And we all know, just from the last thing that we talked about, that China is actively trying to attack the United States.
This is interesting on so many levels. First off, I didn't feel like Sophos is saying here that this had been an open secret. Even Andy, in some of the text you had put in the rundown, it talks about how the Chief Information Security Officer, Ross McKercher at Sophos, drew, for those watching on the video feed, I'm like moving a finger across my mouth like a zipper across my lips, saying people weren't talking about this. I feel like generally people are aware, like, hey, you do need to maintain and patch and update your network appliances as well. I know that's harder to do. And I know organizations don't always emphasize it. In fact, I will say in my day job, Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. Microsoft does not fund this show or have editorial control over it. So as I like to say, we do this on our own time and on our own dime. But in my day job, one thing I notice is that customers are still almost tunnel visioned on endpoint protection to a fault. They are still in this mindset of endpoint protection will cure everything. I have CrowdStrike, I am safe. And they're not focused enough on maintaining the patch level of all of their equipment, all of their OT equipment, all of their IoT equipment in their environment. I have talked to customers about things like firmware attacks, and they have completely blown me off or rolled their eyes. So when I have helped my Surface team sell Microsoft Surface, one of the things we talk about Surface is that it delivers security from chip to cloud. And what we mean by that is even the firmware in Surface has additional security benefits above and beyond the firmware in almost any other OEM you can buy, because the firmware is developed in the open. It is open source firmware. You can go view it on GitHub. And we go through extra levels of validation that firmware is cryptographically signed and matches. And I could get into that whole conversation, but I've had customers basically kind of go, who cares? Like firmware, like nobody's going to attack the firmware. And like, that's literally what Sophos is talking about, is that they had developed this boot kit, and the way it's worded here, the firewall's low-level code used to boot up the devices. That's firmware. That's what it's describing. It's describing it in layman's terms. This is a firmware attack. This is a boot kit attack. And it's a proof of concept. Maybe it had not been seen in the wild, but certainly was possible to get in the wild. And so we have had this tunnel vision on, it's all Windows' fault. Windows is insecure, allegedly, which really ignores all the great work David Weston and team have done, especially in Windows 11. But that's another story for another time. And if I put CrowdStrike on it, I have secured my business and the problem is solved. And that is, and I realize I'm painting with an overly broad brush and I am throwing people under the bus who don't actually think that way. But this just shows even the things we think are protecting us, our firewalls, can be targets against us. And it's funny how it's life imitating art, because this goes all the way back to 1994 and Sandra Bullock in the Hollywood film The Net. And if you remember, they had effectively a backdoor in the firewalls. And that's how the Praetorians were getting into all these systems and breaking in, is because they had a deal with the firewall vendor whose name escapes me at the moment. But that was basically the concept. Now, that was more of a bad guy, obviously. But this is the same concept of, if we can deploy this boot kit and build a back door into firewalls at organizations everywhere, we can just kind of leave the back door unlocked and sneak in and own the joint. Because of course, organizations are not mature enough in zero trust, and they haven't segmented their networks, and they still have overly permissive controls once I'm inside the trusted network, and so on and so forth. So How do we solve against this? Well, we always talk about on this show, what's actionable feedback you can get from this? Well, number one, read this report. Understand the breadth and depth and sophistication of these attacks. That's step one, is know the problem. But step two would be, how are we monitoring our patch levels? How are we building maintenance windows in to make sure these are constantly patched and updated? How are we building in defense in depth? And how are we looking at security more holistically, as opposed to just an endpoint problem, but every device everywhere is at risk, and building that true zero trust network architecture so that even if the attacker can get in through here, we have additional blast doors that are going to close to minimize the blast radius of the attack effectively. Look at T-Mobile above. Even though the attackers, very sophisticated ones, had gotten in, no customer data was impacted. They weren't able to take anything meaningful. That's our goal. That's our North Star. It's not to stop them from getting in at all. It's to minimize the blast radius of what they can do. And so this should be a wake-up call to everyone, that when we talk about things like protecting firmware or building trust all the way through the boot chain, from chip to cloud, we mean it. All matters. That all should be under your consideration moving forward, and not just the runtime software and how we protect that, but how we protect all the infrastructure and everything in between. This, again, Andy, I am so glad you put this here. I think is a great wake-up call for anybody listening or watching the show, and how we need to think bigger and broader and more holistically and trust everything less moving forward.
All right. The final thing I wanted to talk about is a new social media platform called Bluesky has really exploded in the last week, and they're adding more than 1 million users per day. And the last time I checked, they're at 18 million users now. And you might not have heard of them because Bluesky has been flying under the radar. They have been around since 2019, but it was invitation only until February this year. And that kind of let the developers deal with a lot of the kinks behind the scene to try to stabilize it before opening the doors to the wider public. But this new surge of users has tested that platform, and there have been a few outages, but the engineers have done a great job overall, and I think the platform is still pretty stable. It is a Twitter-esque platform, so if you go to it and you sign up and get an account, you're going to see that it's very much like Twitter. And a lot of the users are jumping from Twitter, now called X, to Bluesky. And on this show, we've done shows on Mastodon and Threads, and throughout the last couple of years, and these were supposed to be Twitter killers. They were supposed to dethrone it, and it hasn't. Twitter has persisted and lived on. But I do personally think that Bluesky has the capability to succeed where Mastodon and Threads have failed. Mastodon has been around for over a decade, but it was difficult for the masses, the normal user, to sign up for an account and understand how that platform is decentralized. And overall, it was not a very easy platform to go to. And Threads, although extremely easy to sign up for because it's linked to your Instagram account, the fact that it was owned by Meta and the algorithm was a little wonky, I think really discouraged a lot of users from using it. And so Bluesky, I think, again, will succeed because, number one, it is extremely easy now to just sign up for an account, and the algorithm is pretty good, and it's not owned by any of the big companies. It's actually a U.S. public benefit corporation right now. So I do think that it has the ability to actually bloom into a very good community. It is decentralized, so it's very much like Mastodon, where it's decentralized, meaning that any user can host their data on a server other than those owned by the company. But the majority of the users just sign up and are on the Bluesky servers. So if you see their handle and it says, so-and-so dot or at bsk.social, that means they're on the Bluesky hosted servers. You can also get your own domain handle by adding a verification in your DNS records. So for example, I own the domain age, and so I was able to just add a text record into my DNS, and I was able to get the handle at ajaw0.com, which it was previously ajaw0 at bsky.social, but I was able to just change it really easily by adding a text record into my DNS, and now I have that handle. It's also a great way to make sure that you verify someone, as opposed to the blue seal on Twitter where you're paying for that verification and anyone can pay for that now. Because you own the DNS records, it's fairly certain that you are who you say you are. So like big brands should be able to do this and get those records. I don't know, between like social media and IT and getting that in there may be a little bit of a internal process, but if you see the handle at Microsoft.com, you know that it was someone who updated the actual top level domain Microsoft.com and put that verification in there, which is pretty certain that that is owned by the company. The former head of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, created Bluesky, but he's actually no longer part of the team. He stepped down from the board in May of 2024. He also deleted his account in September. It now is run and predominantly owned by the chief executive, Jay Graber, as, like I said, a U.S. public benefit corporation. Now, while the growth has been significant in this last week, it's going to be a while before Bluesky really becomes like a challenge to Twitter. Twitter doesn't really share its total numbers, but it is understood to be in the hundreds of millions. Elon Musk has previously stated the platform had 250 million users each day. And also, there's no current advertising, which is a bonus, but it's uncertain how they're going to make money in the future. They started off with funding from investors and venture capital firms that raised a ton of money. And Bluesky has said that they want to avoid advertisements, so they might look into like paid services. For example, having people pay for their custom domains in their usernames, like what I'm doing right now, that's free, but possibly in the future they might charge people for that. So all this to say, why does Blue Security Podcast care about Bluesky, and why do we care about Mastodon, and why do we care about Twitter? Because information, timely information, is important in InfoSec, and forever Twitter has been the tool, and it still pretty much is for the most part, but a lot of InfoSec professionals have scattered since Elon purchased Twitter. There was and still is a bunch of them on the Mastodon server, infosec.exchange. I do have an account there, but again, Mastodon is a little bit more difficult to use, and so I haven't used it much. And in this process of Bluesky, I actually got an invite probably last year, and I've had an account. Now I've been using it daily for the last couple of days. I have found many of the InfoSec professionals that I had followed on Twitter. They're on Bluesky, and they are active or cross-posting, whatever. But another thing that's important to note of why this is also happening just in the last couple of days is because Twitter recently changed their terms of service. As of November 15th, their terms of service say, by submitting, posting, or displaying content on or through the services, you grant us a worldwide, non-exclusive, royalty-free license to make your content available to the rest of the world, which includes the right to analyze any of that content, including, for example, for the use with and training of our machine learning and intelligence, artificial intelligence models, whether generative or another type. And this is enabled by default. So basically, you're consenting to allowing your post to train their AI, which is called Gronk. You're allowing your content to be used for training, which is not great. You can go and turn it off, which I have done in my Twitter as well. You just go into the privacy settings and turn it off. But again, it's enabled by default, so not a lot of people are going to do this unless they are very privacy, focused, and they understand that it is turned on by default. And there is a button to delete your conversation history, allegedly. I don't know if you do that, if it will actually delete everything. I'm probably going to try it in the near future, but this is concerning for a lot of people. They don't want their content being used to train AI models. So from what I've seen so far on Bluesky, this might be the one platform that causes me to abandon Twitter completely. I don't know if I'll eventually just delete my account if if I care about holding on to the handle, so on and so forth. But it seems to be the place that is much friendlier right now. The longevity of it is still to be determined, but I have enjoyed it these last few days where I'm not getting ads and toxic content. I'm there to find information, timely information about things. And so I think this might be the one.
This is very interesting to follow now, as Andy, our generation, you and I, we've been of the age, we've seen all of these come and some of them go over time. The rise and fall of, now I'm going to blank on the name. What was
MySpace?
Sure, mine's MySpace, yes, but like Vine. Remember Vine and some of these other video platforms and all the different social networks that tried to launch on the iPhone, like during the gold rush days. Path. I remember, here's a crazy, like, speaking of invitations, when I got my first Gmail invitation, I traded it to a gal for an Orkut invitation, ORKUT, which was a social network that Google acquired and never was really popular in the United States, but felt like it might take off. LiveJournal. I mean, we've seen these come and go. So you kind of get the sense of like the vibe of when is this becoming viable or not. And we all know it's all about that social graph. It's when is there enough critical mass on this service where my friends are going to be there or the people I want to follow, and it's going to be worth my time. If it's just a ghost town, nobody wants to hang out there and nobody wants to put the effort in posting. And so it becomes this, social networks are the perfect encapsulation of catch-22. I don't want to post there because nobody else is there. Nobody else is there because nobody posts there. It becomes that vicious cycle, that feedback loop. And so it's really hard. Especially, I didn't realize this service had been around since 2019. I mean, it's almost 6 years old. That's an eternity in social network years to gain that critical mass. And so I never signed up for Mastodon because I could kind of look at it and go, this is never going to catch on. This is too geeky. This is too complicated for its own good. The ideals are solid. I understand the desire of, we want to create something decentralized so no Elon can come in and take over the service and ruin it ever again. I get that. Or Zuckerberg or whomever. But the reality is, although some of us really care about that, the majority of people don't. They just don't. They don't care as long as they're getting value from the service itself. There are very few boomers, which make up the majority of like Facebook's user group today, that probably love Mark Zuckerberg, but they just don't care that much because everyone else is on there posting about how kids these days don't drink out of the hose or whatever boomers post on Facebook nowadays. Meta, I think, not Meta, Threads specifically, I think it's gotten a little bit of a bad rap. Threads is actually like really active and there's a ton of people over there, but the conversation is very different. And it's less like, to your point, Andy, you talked about timely information. Threads is less about like what's happening right now. You don't go to Threads to hang out and like watch a game with other people or live tweet an event. It's more conversational, but actually, if you look at the monthly active users in Threads, it has continued to grow. It's an extremely popular service. And for the most part, this term they use on Windows Weekly in certification, where they're talking about how a service kind of goes downhill over time, hasn't happened to Threads yet. Basically no ads on it. And the algorithm is interesting because it came from Instagram, and your Instagram graph may not map like who do you follow on Twitter. It's going to be like a different algorithm based on your followers and the kind of content they post, so on and so forth. So there is this kind of misconception over how Threads is doing. There's this concept that it's a failure. It's not. Threads is really successful, but it's a different type of service. I see it as more conversational and less like topical, what's happening right now. And I will say, again, skeptical about Mastodon, but Bluesky, excuse me for 1 second, what I've observed with it is exactly what you're talking about. I've had so many people post on Twitter saying, hey, here's my Bluesky username. Hey, here's my Bluesky account. Hey, I'm going over to Bluesky. It's a movement, and it's real. And it's not just a couple of like curmudgeonly like tech enthusiasts. It is mainstream people. It's mainstream accounts. It's real what's happening over there. I haven't created an account yet. I think I need to get on it now that we've talked about it on this show, because I do feel that momentum that I really haven't felt before for another like Twitter competitor. Because even Threads, although it was bootstrapped with a social graph out of the gate, again, it's a different social graph because Instagram being a visual medium, I'm not following like a bunch of sports reporters for the sports teams I follow. I don't really care about their Instagram posts, but I really love their text posts on Twitter, keeping me updated on my favorite sports teams. So my Threads social graph never matched that. But when I have the opportunity to curate a new social graph on Bluesky and the people there I care about are there, it's really compelling. So I think I am going to head over and sign up and check it out and maybe start monitoring it and cross posting as well. It feels like something's real. Now, I still don't know if decentralization, although a noble goal, is actually beneficial in the long run to building the social network, because in the past that has not helped a social network grow. The like one exception to that, and this is so long ago it doesn't match current engagement models at all, is IRC. IRC was Internet Relay Chat, for those not familiar, was very decentralized, although it had different networks like FNet and a couple others, but it was very decentralized and very popular for its time. And I just don't know if we've seen that since, because there is something to be said for singular vision, singular development path, and all of that. Now, the one thing I'm curious about, and I don't know, is does Bluesky allow third-party app developers to create their own clients? Because the one thing I miss so much on Twitter, I always use a third-party client. I use Tweetbot, and I love Tweetbot and paid them lots of money to use Tweetbot because it was so much better than the native client. And then Elon bought it and shut it down, and it made me very sad. And I know when Mastodon came out, the Tweetbot folks took their code base, mapped it to Mastodon, and made a Mastodon client based on Tweetbot. And that almost got me to use Mastodon on that fact alone. So if they can take that code base again and make it a Bluesky client, now we're talking. So I'm definitely excited to check it out more. And I know cybersecurity professionals tend to be a little more vocal in their leanings as far as like their political beliefs, their right and wrong perspectives on the world, and they do vote with their shoes. They will leave a service because they feel like it doesn't map to their ideals. And many of them vocally left Twitter years ago when Elon first took over, if not more recently, now that it looks like Elon is going to work very hand in hand with President-elect Trump. That will continue to drive people away from that service. And it's sad because we're all in one spot and now we've kind of scattered, and it's where are we going to reconvene in the future? And maybe that's Bluesky. I hope it is, because it would be great to get this community back under one roof after being so scattered for the last, 3 years or so? 2 or 3 years now. It's been a while since we've all been under one roof, and certainly miss that. So yeah, great topic to bring up, and certainly, this isn't the Blue Social Network podcast, but man, I could talk about social networks for a while because they're fascinating. Good subject of conversation.
Yeah, and a follow-up to your comment on third-party connectors. If you remember, there was a popular third-party app, a web app called TweetDeck.
Yeah.
And many people use TweetDeck, and they really liked it. And I used to use it, and it was great. There is a developer who has developed something called BlueDeck. And so I believe in the works of, developers being able to develop other apps. I don't know of another app that you can connect to Bluesky with currently, but the fact that there is something called BlueDeck, and it is third-party developed, and it's very similar to TweetDeck. If you ever use TweetDeck, you have columns and notifications and multiple accounts, so on and so forth. You're able to schedule things through BlueDeck, which you actually can't do through the native platform. You can't schedule anything. There are a lot of things that are still missing that are coming, features that people transferring from other social network platforms might not be happy that they're not there. For example, being able to schedule stuff natively, or being able drafts is a big one. Like, if you craft something up and you want to post it later, there's no drafts currently, no ability to edit, no bookmarks. But there are like ways around it. There are some things that once you get onto the platform, you'll find you can create a feed of your own or have a list, and there's ways to adapt it. Every social media network has its own niche, but I do think that Bluesky will have third-party apps eventually in the future.
It feels in line with their approach for sure. If they're going to be decentralized and have an API, I mean, you would think that would be coming. Maybe they're just the developers waiting for it to gain more adoption, but certainly the last week should motivate them. And by the way, I looked it up. The Tweetbot port, if you will, for Mastodon is called Ivory, which is a very clever name, actually. I personally haven't used it because I'm not on Mastodon, but if you want a great third-party client for Mastodon, Ivory would definitely recommend, just based on the pedigree of the developers alone and the great software they write.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes, along with the links that we used for this show, if you want to read on further. Or if you have topics you want us to talk about in the future, feel free to contact us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.